All right, so you want to dive deep into Hebrews 4:15, huh? We're
Yeah.
talking about going beyond just the words, really getting into some unique takes.
Yeah, we've got a whole stack of sermons here from pastors who seriously got creative. They took this familiar verse and really, kind of flipped it on its head.
So this is for you, pastors, Bible study leaders, anyone who wants to present this verse in a way that's going to make people go, whoa, I never thought about it like that before.
Right, like they already know what it says, they need something more.
Exactly. We've got sermons, analogies, even a bit of historical context thrown in for good measure. Charles Spurgeon even makes an
I
appearance.
love when Spurgeon shows up. Always a good sign things are about to get deep.
Oh, it gets deep. Okay, so are you ready for this? One pastor compared Jesus's temptations to baking bread.
Baking bread. Now that's an analogy I gotta hear.
Trust me, you'll want to stick around for that one. But first, let's talk about something that kept popping up in these sermons, this idea of empathy, not just sympathy.
Yeah, I noticed that too. It's like a lot of these pastors were pushing back against this kind of surface level understanding of, Jesus feels bad for you.
Right. Like, oh, poor you, you're struggling with temptation. It's way more than that, though.
Way more. It's like you're saying, no, 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 Jesus gets it. He's been there. He's felt the pull of those temptations in his own
And
lives.
that's huge, because it means he doesn't just understand our struggles in some abstract theoretical way. He's experienced them firsthand.
Which is like the whole point of Hebrews 4:15, right? He can empathize with our weaknesses because he's been through it himself.
Okay, so like in this sermon from Stout Springs Church, they talked about the specific temptations Jesus faced. And they weren't like super spiritual or anything.
Yeah, they pointed out how it was stuff we all deal with. The need for comfort, wanting power, wanting to be popular, basic human stuff.
Exactly. I
Yeah.
mean, who hasn't felt the pull of those things at some point? It makes Jesus so much more relatable, so much more human.
It does. It makes that whole high priest who sympathizes with our weaknesses thing so much more real.
So it's not just some theological concept, it's personal.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. How do we actually convey that to our congregations? Like, how do we help them grasp that depth of empathy?
Well, buckle up because these pastors have some seriously creative ideas. They use illustrations and analogies that are just pure gold.
Like, seriously, I was taking notes left and right, stuff I never even considered
Yeah,
before.
like who had thought to use a bread analogy for trusting God's timing?
That was Spout Springs Church. I got to give them props for that one. Okay, so picture this.
I'm picturing bread. What kind of bread?
Any kind. But they're talking about if you rush the process, you don't let the dough rise properly. What do you get?
A brick, or, well, a very sad flat loaf.
Exactly. But if you're patient, if you trust the process, you let that dough do its thing.
You get this beautiful, fluffy, flavorful loaf of bread.
Boom. And they connect that to waiting on God's timing in our lives. We often try to force things, rush the process, but God's working behind the scenes preparing us.
It's a great reminder that patience isn't just about sitting around and doing nothing. It's about trusting that God's got a plan, even when we can't see it.
And the best part is they don't just drop the analogy and move on. They really unpack it. They connect it back to the spiritual truth.
Yeah, it's not just a cute little gimmick. It actually helps you understand the concept on a deeper level.
Okay, so we've got empathy versus sympathy. We've got the amazing bread analogy. What other treasures did you dig up in this sermon stack?
Okay, get ready for some serious visual imagery. Thrive Church NZ. They brought the drama with this one.
Oh, I love it when churches bring the drama. Tell me more.
So they're talking about this image of like two oceans colliding.
Two oceans colliding.
Yeah, one representing life, the other one death. And right where they meet, bam, a miracle takes place.
Wow, that's intense. I can see that on a screen behind the pastor, waves crashing, really dramatic.
It's powerful, right? And it totally captures the reality of what Jesus did on the cross. He stood at the intersection of life and death, and through his sacrifice, he brought life out of death.
It's like in those nature documentaries where you see a huge wave crash on the shore, and then when the water pulls back, there's all this new life springing up.
Exactly. It's a visual representation of how Jesus brings hope and renewal to the most broken parts of our lives.
Okay, so we've got some seriously strong imagery going on. But what about the pastors who went, I don't know, a little deeper, like explored themes you might not immediately think of with Hebrews 4:15?
No, there are definitely a few of those. Like, did you ever think about Hebrews 4:15 and conflict resolution in the church?
Conflict resolution. That's an interesting connection. Tell me more.
Yeah, this was from College Hill Presbyterian. They were basically saying if Jesus could empathize with our weaknesses, then we should be able to empathize with each other.
Especially in the church. We're all supposed to be on the same team and all that.
Yeah, right. But we're human. We mess up. We disagree. But they're saying we got to approach those conflicts with empathy, remembering that everyone's fighting their own battles.
Because holding on to anger and resentment, that just creates more division. And that's the opposite of what Jesus calls us to do.
Exactly. So it's like taking that empathy we have from Jesus and extending it to the people around us, especially those who are hard to love.
It's a good reminder that Hebrews 4:15 isn't just about our individual relationship with Jesus. It's about how his example can transform our relationships with each other.
And get this, they even brought in research from like a secular communications professor who specializes in conflict resolution.
Wow, a secular source in a sermon.
Right?
That's pretty bold.
It was.
Yeah.
But they did it really well. They used this expert's insights to like illuminate the biblical principles of empathy and forgiveness.
I love that because it shows that those biblical principles aren't just some outdated ideas. They're backed up by real-world research and experience.
Right. They're still relevant today. Okay, so that's conflict resolution. But then Life Church, they went in a totally different direction. They focused on the relentless pursuit of God.
The relentless pursuit of God. Okay, now I'm intrigued. Break that down for me.
So they're basically saying God isn't just sitting back and waiting for us to get our act together. He's actively seeking us out, drawing us to himself, even when we're running in the opposite direction.
And that's a pretty comforting thought, especially when you feel lost or distant from God.
Yeah.
Knowing that he's still pursuing you, even when you're messing up.
And to illustrate this, they shared a story about a Hollywood producer who got invited to church by a friend.
A Hollywood producer. Now, that's not your typical churchgoer. I'm picturing like a sunglasses indoors, super jaded Hollywood type.
Right. You wouldn't think they'd be interested in faith at all. But the friend kept inviting him, and guess what? This producer ended up finding faith in a way he never expected.
That's awesome. I love those stories where God just shows up in unexpected ways.
And it really drives home the point that God is always at work, even in the most unlikely places, drawing people to himself, like even in Hollywood.
It's a good reminder to never underestimate the power of a personal invitation, because you never know who might be open to hearing about Jesus, even if they seem like the least likely candidate.
Exactly. And this idea of God relentlessly pursuing us ties directly back to Hebrews 4:15. Because if Jesus understands our weaknesses, our struggles, then he also knows how to reach us.
Even when we're putting up walls or running away.
Right. He's constantly knocking on the door of our hearts, patiently waiting for us to open it.
And when we finally do, we realize he's not there to judge us or condemn us. He just wants to welcome us home.
And that welcome, that unconditional love, is the foundation of our relationship with him. It's not based on how good we are. It's based on his grace.
Which is like the ultimate message of hope. And you know what? Speaking of hope, I got to bring up that Charles Spurgeon quote from Life Church's sermon. It's a real zing.
Oh, yeah, that one's powerful. You want to share it?
You stand before God as if you were Christ, because Christ stood before God as if he were you. Whoa.
Yeah, let that one sink in for a minute.
Like a punch to the gut in the best way possible. It makes you realize just how radical God's grace really is.
It's mind-blowing when you really think about it. Jesus took our place so we could stand before God clothed in his righteousness.
It changes everything about how we see ourselves and how we approach God. We don't have to be perfect. We don't have to earn his love. We're already accepted because of what Jesus did for us.
And because of that, we can approach God with confidence, knowing we're fully loved and forgiven.
And we can offer that same grace and love to others, even when they don't deserve it.
It all comes back to empathy, doesn't it? It's the key to unlocking the power of Hebrews 4:15.
Empathy changes everything. It changes how we see ourselves, how we see God, and how we see each other.
And this is just the tip of the iceberg. These sermons have given us so much to think about.
They really have. And we've got even more insights to share, so stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive into Hebrews 4:15.
You won't want to miss it. All right, so we left off talking about all these cool themes pastors were using to connect Hebrews 4:15 with their congregations. You know, things like conflict resolution. But one sermon that really stuck with me was from Crossroads Christian Fellowship. They took this fascinating approach comparing Jesus to, get this, Adam.
Oh, yeah. I remember that one. It's that whole second Adam concept, right?
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever heard a sermon on that before.
Me neither, really. But it was so good. They start by reminding everyone about Adam, you know, the first human created in God's image. He's got this perfect garden, no worries, but then
He gives in to temptation. Eats the forbidden fruit.
Exactly. Disobeys God. And that, kind of messes everything up, brings sin and death into the world.
Yeah, talk about consequences.
Right. Heavy stuff. But then they bring in Jesus, who's often called the second Adam. He comes to earth, fully human, and guess what?
He faces temptation too, just like Adam. Except Jesus resists.
Exactly. He overcomes where Adam failed. And through that obedience, they're saying he redeems humanity, opens the way for us to have a relationship with God again.
Whoa, when you put it like that, it adds this whole other level of meaning to Jesus overcoming temptation. It's not just about him personally.
It's cosmic, like this huge victory echoing through all of history.
It's like Adam messed it up for everyone, and then Jesus comes along and fixes it.
Okay.
Okay, so for pastors thinking about preaching on Hebrews 4:15, this second Adam thing could be like a gold mine.
Definitely. So much symbolism to unpack there. But speaking of unique themes, remember how we talked about those sermons that went in totally different directions? What else did you find?
Oh man, there's this one that really blew my mind. College Hill Presbyterian. They
Yeah.
focused on, wait for it, conflict resolution in the church.
Conflict resolution, how they even tie that in?
I know, right? But it was so clever. They basically said if Jesus, who's perfect, can empathize with our weaknesses, then we should be able to empathize with each other, especially within the church.
It makes sense when you think about it like that. Like, we're all messed up, we all make mistakes, we gotta give each other a break.
Totally. And they made this point that approaching conflict with empathy, remembering everyone's got their own stuff going on, can totally change the outcome. Like, instead of getting defensive, try to understand where the other person is coming from.
Yeah, because let's face it, holding on to anger and resentment doesn't do anyone any good. Just creates more division.
And that's like the opposite of what Jesus wants for the church.
Right.
Unity, love, all that good stuff.
Right. So in a way, it's taking that empathy we receive from Jesus and paying it forward, offering that same grace to others, even when it's tough.
So it's not just a me and Jesus thing. Hebrews 4:15 can actually impact how we treat each other, how we handle disagreements. Okay, but here's the kicker. They quoted a secular source in their sermon, like a communications professor, an expert in conflict resolution.
Whoa, a secular source. That's a bold move.
Right, but they totally pulled it off. They used this expert's insights to help explain, the biblical principles of empathy and forgiveness.
I love that because it shows that those principles aren't just some dusty old ideas. They're actually backed up by real-world research and what people are experiencing today.
Exactly. They're still relevant, still powerful. Okay, so that was conflict resolution. But then we have Life Church, and they went in a completely different direction. They talked about the relentless pursuit of God.
Ooh, the relentless pursuit of God.
Okay, now I'm curious. Tell me everything.
Okay, so they're saying, God isn't just sitting up there watching us, waiting for us to mess up. He's actively seeking us out. He's drawing us closer to him, even when we're, running in the opposite direction.
That's a pretty amazing thought,
Yeah.
Especially when you feel far away from God or like you've really messed things up.
Yeah.
To know that he's still there, still reaching out to you, it's comforting.
It really is. And they have this incredible story to illustrate this point. Get this. It's about a Hollywood producer. A Hollywood producer. I'm picturing a big shot movie exec all about money and fame. Not exactly the kind of person you'd think would be interested in church.
Right. But one of his friends kept inviting him to church, and guess what? The guy actually went. And he ended up finding faith in a way he never expected.
That's awesome. Talk about God working in mysterious ways.
It really is. It just shows you that God is always at work, even in the most unexpected places. And sometimes he uses the most unlikely people to reach others.
And it's a great reminder for all of us. Never underestimate the power of a personal invitation. Because you never know who might be open to hearing about Jesus, even if they seem like the least likely person.
Okay, so back to Hebrews 4:15. How does this whole relentless pursuit of God thing tie in with that?
Well, think about it. If Jesus understands our weaknesses, our struggles, all the reasons why we might push God away, then he also knows exactly how to reach us.
Even when we're putting up walls or trying to hide from him.
Right. It's like he's constantly knocking on the door of our hearts, patiently waiting for us to let him in.
And then, when we finally do open that door, we discover he is not waiting to judge us or condemn us. He just wants to welcome us home with love and grace.
And that welcome, that unconditional love, it's what our relationship with God is built on. It's not about how good we are, how many rules we follow. It's about His grace. It's a free gift.
And that, my friend, is the ultimate message of hope. Speaking of hope, I got to bring up that Charles Spurgeon quote from Life Church's sermon. It's a total mind blower.
Oh, yeah, the one about standing before God as Christ. Powerful stuff. You want to share it?
You stand before God as if you were Christ, because Christ stood before God as if he were you.
Whoa. Yeah, let that one sink in for a second.
It's like a punch to the gut, but in a good way.
Sure.
It just hits you with the full force of God's grace. Like, wow, Jesus really took our place so we could be completely accepted by God.
And that changes everything, right? It affects how we see ourselves, how we approach God. We don't have to be perfect. We don't have to earn His love. It's already ours.
And because of that, we can approach God with confidence. No fear of judgment, just pure love and acceptance.
And because we've experienced that kind of grace, we can offer it to others, even when they don't deserve it.
It all comes back to empathy, doesn't it? It's like this golden thread running through Hebrews 4:15.
It really is. Empathy changes everything. How we see ourselves, how we see God, how we relate to other people. It's powerful stuff.
And we're just scratching the surface here. These sermons have given us so much to think about. So many different angles, so many fresh perspectives.
And we've got even more to share. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground with Hebrews 4:15, right? Empathy, historical connections, creative illustrations, even conflict resolution, and the relentless pursuit of God. It's been pretty amazing seeing how many different ways pastors are approaching this verse.
Seriously. But, the big question is, how do our listeners actually UAZ all these insights? Like, how do we take all this great stuff and turn it into, a message that's really going to connect with our congregations? What's the takeaway?
Right, right. It can't just stay theoretical. We got to make it practical.
Right.
I think the key is going beyond the surface, like going deeper than just the obvious stuff. We got to find those specific points that will make this verse come alive for people.
So less Jesus loves you, more nitty-gritty, how does this apply to my life kind of stuff?
Exactly. So first things first, I think we have to emphasize how personal Jesus's empathy is. He's not some distant figure who just observes our struggles. He's been there in the trenches, experiencing those same temptations.
It's not just head knowledge, it's heart knowledge.
Yeah. And because of that, we can approach God honestly without fear of being judged.
Totally. And it changes how we relate to each other, too. Like, we can be more understanding, more forgiving, because we get how hard it is to be human. It's like that Spurgeon quote, you stand before God as if you were Christ, because Christ stood before God as if he were you. It's just so powerful.
Seriously, it makes you realize how completely we're accepted by God,
Okay, so we've got personal connection. What else?
I think we also need to challenge our congregations to really get specific about the temptations they face in their own lives.
Not just temptation in general, but the things that really trip them up personally.
Exactly. And then encourage them to view those struggles through the lens of Hebrews 4:15.
So instead of feeling ashamed or condemned, they can remember that Jesus gets it, he understands, and he offers them grace and strength to overcome.
Exactly. Now, how can we make this even more practical, like in a sermon?
Give me some ideas. I'm all ears.
Okay, so you could start by just asking your congregation a direct question, something like, what's one area where you feel particularly tempted right now?
Ooh, I like that. Gets them thinking right off the bat.
Right. And then you could guide them through a process of reflecting on that struggle, but in light of Jesus's own experience. Maybe share a story from your own life about a time when you faced a similar temptation.
That would make it so relatable.
And then bring it back around to the truth of Hebrews 4:15. Remind them that they're not alone, Jesus understands, and he offers them grace to overcome.
That's a killer sermon outline right there. Practical, engaging, and it connects the dots between this ancient text and what people are dealing with today.
That's what it's all about. Bridging that gap, making the Bible come alive.
This has been such an incredible deep dive. I feel like I've got a whole new understanding of Hebrews 4:15 and so many new ideas for preaching on it.
Me too. It's amazing what happens when we challenge ourselves to look at familiar verses with fresh eyes. You never know what gems you might uncover.
So true. Well, pastors, Bible study leaders, anyone listening, I hope you're leaving this deep dive feeling energized and inspired, ready to take these insights and make them your own.
Remember, Hebrews 4:15 isn't just a verse to memorize. It's a source of hope and encouragement that can truly change lives.
Absolutely. So go out there and share it with passion, with conviction. Until next time, keep digging deeper into God's Word.